Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
In her latest book, Punished for Dreaming, Dr. Bettina Love describes a friend and teammate named Zakia Van Hoos. She's often referred to as Zook. Bettina says that she idolized Zook, but not everyone treated Zook with the respect she deserved. Dr. Love writes, "No educator ever told Zook that she was smart, clever, or capable of excelling at school. In fact, she received no academic encouragement ever. Instead of support, Zook experienced violence. When she was 11, Zook says a teacher slammed her into a chair and put her in a chokehold. Zook spoke about her experiences in a promotional video for Professor Love's book last year.
When I think about that kind of stuff and I look at where I am, I'm like, thank you to all those teachers that stepped on me. Thank you to the athletic director that gave up on me. Currently, I'm a phenomenal basketball coach, 3-time Coach of the Year. I work with some amazing young women that have went on to awesome colleges. Have a couple that's in WNBA as well.
Punished for Dreaming details many of the challenges that Zook faced. And although Zook persevered, the book cautions against only seeing this as a story of resilience. Instead, Professor Love writes that it's a story of how the education system, quote, threw her away. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Today, we're taking a look at inequities in U.S. education. Later in the show, sociologist Anthony Abraham Jack explains how admitting a more diverse student body is just the start of making college more inclusive. Up first, Dr. Bettina Love. She's the William F. Russell Professor at Teachers College, Columbia University. She's also the winner of the 2024 Stowe Prize for Literary Activism and author of Punished for Dreaming: How School Reform Harms Black Children and How We Heal. Professor, it's great to have you on Disrupted.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Let's get into this book because one of the most compelling pieces of it is that you are able to share personal stories of people who have been affected by this system, those who are committed to dismantling that system, and really bring it home to people beyond the data and the numbers. And it makes me curious about, what is it about your own journey that as you were becoming a scholar made you say, hey, this is where I really want to uplift what's happening on the ground?
I've been really trying to write this book for a very long time. It's been in my head a very long time. Before I was a researcher, before I was a teacher, I was curious. I was curious about what happened to kids like me. I was curious about how I went to a high school with 400 kids in our freshman class and less than 100 graduated. I was curious. I've always been curious of where did all those kids go? What happened to all those kids? And so when I became like an educational researcher and I was writing books, I always wanted to tell the story and try to make sense of what happened to 80s and 90s babies educationally and what our experiences were. And I grew up in it. I know it. I got friends in it. And so this book has been in me for a very long time of really wanting to chronicle and tell the stories of my generation. And I knew a policy book would not be that interesting without real people. Because I think we often think about policy as numbers, as data, as, this policy was instituted in this year, but it's real people's lives behind those policies.
You also bring up this concept of white rage, which originates in the work of Carol Anderson. Talk to us about what white rage means and how it shows up in the experiences, the lineage of people that you are raising the stories in this book.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up the work of Carol Anderson. I really think she's one of our most prolific scholars. I really love everything she writes and everything she does. She's out of Emory University, and she wrote this book called White Rage. And what she argues is that White rage is about policy. It's about how you can how you can make your racism a ban, how you can make your racism a reform, how you can make your racism and anti-Blackness legislation, right? That is white rage. And so she says, we don't talk about how policy is a manifestation of white rage. And so I wanted to anchor her work to talk about educational white rage. And I think what we're seeing right now is educational white rage. We see folks who are using their anti-Blackness views and turning that into policy, turning that into reforms, turning that into book bans.
Talk about the source of that rage. Because if we look at outcomes, we look at the data, kids of color, Black kids in particular, are still struggling in spaces that others say they should be thriving. And yet there is this fear, whether we're talking about Supreme Court policies or school-based implementation, this fear that white folks are losing out and that other groups are challenging their standing or challenging their ability to move forward. Why then the rage? What is the source of that if the data shows that people are still doing okay in certain ways?
I don't think it has anything to do with data. I don't think it's ever had anything to do with data. We can give folks data nonstop. Um, I can show you, forget data. I can show you videos of Black folks dying in the street. I can show you live videos of Black folks being killed in the street. And folks are like, well, he shouldn't have been there. She shouldn't have did that. So I don't think it's about data. I really don't. I think it's about the idea that Black folks are not worthy, that Black folks are criminal, that Black folks are not deserving. And when you believe a certain beliefs about a certain group of people, then it's not about data. It's about your beliefs. And that's why we have so many people who ideas don't go in line with data. You're like, well, that's not what the data says, but this is what I'm doing. So, I try to argue in the book, particularly in education. Education is one of those fields where we have so much data that we should be doing this, and we're not. Like, we have so much data that says that all children right now are facing chronic absenteeism. Like, we have 26% of students right now who are facing chronic absenteeism. And we're seeing that absenteeism cut across races and socioeconomic backgrounds. We're not doing anything about that. We know that we have less than 2% of teachers who are Black males. We're not doing anything about that. We know that there's parts of this country, not all, that are facing a teaching shortage. We're not doing anything about that. We have data that says that our children, all children, came out of the pandemic maybe a year behind in some subjects. We have no data, no national campaign to catch them up. September 10th, we had a presidential debate, and not one question was asked about education. 6 days prior was a school shooting. So it's not about data. It's truly not about data. We can go on and on about data. Data is only meaningful if the people who have the data actually believe that these issues that the data is raising is worth doing something about.
You do a lot of work with young people in schools, outside of schools, in communities. You are one of the few researchers who listens to young people, not just thinking about how can I judge them or how can I fit this into the narrative for my project, but how can the experiences of young people shape what I do, right? And with whom you do that work of change. What are you hearing from the young people that you're working with about this feeling that people are either not talking about them at all or only talking about them as a problem and not as possibility? What are you hearing?
Yeah, I would say young people say to me all the time, you all say that we're the future, but you don't listen to us. Oh, the young kids, they're the future. Well, you got to listen to the young kids. You can't sit here and put all that on them and then not listen to them. And so young people have solutions. Young people have things they want to say. Young people have ideas. that are worthy of us listening to because they have a perspective that we don't have. We used to have. I think, I always joke and say, I think when you become 30, like something happens. I don't know what switch goes off, but you just become conservative. And I'm not talking conservative as far as like political party. There's something when you turn 30, you're just like, oh my God, I can't believe what these children are doing. Come on, we were not too long ago, that was us. And I just think that curiosity that young people have, that joy, that determination, that persistence that they have, that quest to get it, the quest to know. Like, I want to know why it's like this. Who did this? Who's responsible for this? Like, they're asking those questions. They're trying to get to the root cause of harm. And that's how we get change in our society. And young people have always been in charge of change. We don't like to talk about King was young, Coretta was young, Malcolm, like these, they were young. We got black and white pictures, so we automatically think they were old. They were young. We had the Children's March, right? They were young. And so young folks have always been at the forefront of change. So that's why I'm always doing my best. And I fall short sometimes, doing my best to listen to young people because the history tells us those are the change makers.
Coming up, more with Professor Bettina Love. She'll explain what she thinks voters should be paying attention to in this election. And later, Professor Anthony Abraham Jack explains some of the challenges that underrepresented college students faced during pandemic lockdowns. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're taking a look at inequities in the U.S. education system. A note for our listeners, this segment discusses mental health and suicide. We're still joined by Professor Bettina Love, author of Punished for Dreaming, How School Reform Harms Black Children and How We Heal. In her book, Professor Love talks about the term super predator. That label originated in the 1990s, and it was often used to refer to teenagers who would allegedly commit violent crimes in increasing numbers. It was most often used to describe Black and Hispanic teenagers, so it often had racist implications. Ask Professor Love to talk more about that term.
I really try to take to task this idea of who are the super predators. I am an 80s, 90s baby. So I grew up with this idea that Black children were disposable, right? When you start to label a group of Black children, super predators, thugs, crack babies, right? You are giving them the language to dispose of us. So when you have a nation of people, politicians, teachers, principals, law officials, nightly news anchors just calling Black children off the cuff. Well, these are crack babies. These are super predators. These are thugs, right? And now you're seeing that language be used again. The best example I can give you is Springfield, Ohio, right? We're watching a group of people be called thugs and basically saying they're super predators, right? With no data, again, just lies, misinformation, and people using it for political gain, not caring about the real lives of people that could be hurt. And so you now have Haitian children, Black children, having to go to school with state troopers patrolled because of the lies that are being told, that they are super predators, that they are thugs, that this is what is embedded in their culture, right? This is just plain out lies. But it's painting a group of people same way 30 years ago, 40 years ago, those lies around who is criminal and criminality. And we see it so much in our society where Black folks and brown folks and indigenous folks are painted as criminal. And once you paint someone as criminal, then you can dispose of them. And everybody believes that disposing of them was right, was righteous. And so that language is so not only hurtful, it is putting a target on your back.
And it is criminal the way that we criminalize young people. I'm thinking about the fact that this is the 70th anniversary of Brown v. Board. And many of the challenges that these young people are facing, I imagine Thurgood Marshall never could have imagined that children in Springfield would have to again contend with dogs and law enforcement just to escort them into a school, of all those things to fight for. And what becomes so damaging is how that becomes ingrained in the psyche of these young people who believe, if all of the places that are supposed to affirm me see me as disposable and unworthy, how then do I think of myself? And how do I think of my future and my role as a citizen? Your work has also drawn attention to not just Black children, but the layers and different identities within that get triggered, whether we're talking about gender or gender identity. This new report from the GAO about how Black girls are punished at disproportionate rates, how Black girls with learning challenges or disabilities become criminalized rather than affirmed. Help us, Dr. Love, take it to that next level of all of these opportunities and spaces where young people should be affirmed and offered opportunities to learn. They then become punished for, as you have said in other work, daring to dream beyond where they are. How do we look at that?
Thank you for bringing that up, because I don't think people understand the plight of Black girls right now in our society. We're seeing Black girls' suicide rates go up. We know that more than any other group, Black girls are being suspended and expelled from schools in astronomical high numbers. And so Black girls in our society, it's like a double-edged sword, because we got Black girl magic everywhere, and Black girls are magical, and Black girls can do anything. And Black girls, we we are the most reliable voting bloc in this country as Black women. Black women read more books than anybody. Black women are more highly educated. Like we have this narrative. And then there's this narrative where Black girls are struggling, where Black girls are committing suicide, where Black girls are facing depression, where Black girls are being told you can be anything you want to be in this world. And then there's so many glass ceilings for us, and how depressing and isolating. We're telling Black girls, hey, get into this profession, get into this profession. You can do this, you can do that. And they can't. But then they get there and they're the only ones. So, my response is, I would love a national movement, right? And Bell Hooks talks about this in her work, a national movement to really talk about the beauty of feminism, right? And how feminism is not about man hating. It's not about not liking men, and has nothing to do with that. It's about saying that women and people who identify as women and queer folks and trans folks, like, it's a movement to say that these folks are worthy and deserving of rights and protection. And understanding that Black women and women of color and our queer and trans women are some of the most vulnerable folks in our society. And we have not done a great job at all with just having those very beautiful, complex conversations. And so I would love if we could just be more open as a country to having thoughtful conversations. And it seems as if we're at a point right now where everybody's in their corner. And if you don't agree with me, then I don't talk to you. I don't talk to you. And that's not productive for democracy. And the people who are at the very margins of society will get hurt the most when we take these particular type of divisive stances. So Black girls are facing so much harm. Black girls with who are neurodivergent, Black girls who are non-able, right? They are going to face, trans girls are going to face some of the most harshest policies and just brutality in our society, because we have the least understanding about their humanity as a group of people. And when you don't have understanding about people's humanity and you don't see it as beautiful, you don't see it as loving, you don't see it as worthy, um, then you do harm to it.
You and I both work in academia, which has done its fair share of harm to
Mhm.
Black women, Black women's psyche. And every time someone breaks a glass ceiling, I wonder, Professor, who gets left to clean up those pieces
Mm,
and who gets harmed by those
mhm,
shards. We are on the cusp of a very consequential election, and not just at the top of the ticket in the national level. There are so many key decisions being made at the local and state level that will have an impact on the very things that you care about. These new conversations about school choice and vouchers and alternatives to quote unquote traditional public education, which often become a proxy for saying, I don't want my kids to have to learn with those kids. So let me get
mhm.
money, public money, to do that in different ways. As you think about this election, the conversations that candidates are or are not having, are there particular things that you say to voters? Pay attention to this because it can have an effect on either addressing some of those harms or exacerbating those harms. What should we be paying attention to?
Well, let me just be really clear. Project 2025. But I also want us to be clear that this is not the beginning of Project 2025. This is the culmination of Project 2025. They have been moving, sometimes at a snail's pace, sometimes very fast, at dismantling the civil rights of Black and Brown folks in public education for the last 70 years, since Brown, right? Since Brown, it has been this divestment in public education. It has been trying to derail any type of civil rights for Black students through funding, through all types of mechanisms, vouchers, like you're saying. Um, but I think we got to be clear that Project 2025 is already here. It's not that if whoever wins this election, yes, it can speed it up, but it's already here and it's been here. Point in case is affirmative action, right? Affirmative action was gutted last year. And now we're watching the impact. We're watching 70 plus years of fight. Oh, I'm talking about fight that our ancestors put in, gutted, right? So we're seeing in real time Project 2025 live out. We're seeing in real time states trying to go towards a voucher program and losing tons of money and still headed that in that direction. And we need to be thinking about our school boards. We're watching book bans. I mean, we've had over 10,000 book bans already. So Project 2025 is here. It is alive and well. And regardless who wins this presidency, we will be fighting Project 2025.
This work that you do is critically important, but it's also heavy, right? I do work on punishment and mass incarceration. And at some point you find yourself going, why couldn't I just study something that was like light and easy, right?
That's a fact.
But there's a calling for you, at least to me, it seems that there's a calling for you to do this work and to think about, as heavy as it is, it's also in some ways a blessing to be able to tell these stories and continue that fight so that others don't give up. But I'm curious, Professor, amid all that you do, what gives you hope that one day we will get this thing right for children?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. James Baldwin says, and I'm paraphrasing here, there's nothing that they can do to you, just put the crown on. And so I truly believe that my ancestors have paid a mighty price. So all I got to do is put the crown on. But what gives me hope is young folk, Black women, the way we organize, the way we strategize, the way we show up. Oh, the way Black women show up. My God. We don't waste no time showing up. Like the way Black women show up, the way Black queer and trans folk show up and build community and push us to think differently. being in community with folk allows you to see the possibilities. And that's why community is so important. Miriam Kaba says, anything worth doing is worth doing in community, because when you are in community with folk, again, you just be like, oh, that's possible. Or I have doc students and students here at Teachers College, and they just push my thinking. I'm like, oh, right. I didn't even think about that. I wasn't thinking about how I had a student who just became chronically um, ill. Like this is now a new life for her. And she said, we talk a lot about healing in our work of abolition. We talk a lot about healing, but what does it mean to have a chronic illness where you will never be healed? And it just really reframed my idea around healing and abolition. So I'm always inspired by my students, by my own children. I'm inspired by my wife, who's an educator, who gets in that classroom and does amazing, amazing things every day. If you just turn off the noise, and look at everyday people, oh, you can find inspiration.
Well, we are so glad that you put that crown on every day and that you are helping to support a new generation of educators who will continue to wear that crown. Bettina Love is William F. Russell Professor at Teachers College, Columbia University. Her newest book, Punished for Dreaming: How School Reform Harms Black Children and How We Heal, is winner of the 2024 Stowe Prize for Literary Activism. Thank you, Professor.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Such great questions and dialogue. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
If you or someone you know is struggling, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's national helpline is 1-800-622-HELP. That's 1-800-622-4357. Colleges and universities often tout the diversity of their incoming classes. But our next guest says that admitting a more diverse student body doesn't necessarily make a school inclusive. Schools also need to make sure that students have the resources that they need to thrive. Dr. Anthony Abraham Jack is the inaugural faculty director of Boston University's Newberry Center and associate professor of higher education leadership at Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. His new book is called Class Dismissed: When Colleges Ignore Inequality and Students Pay the Price. Professor, welcome to Disrupted.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start at a very basic question. How are you defining inequality in this book, and what's the focus for you of that term?
To me, I want to think about the inequities that separate the students who are admitted into school. How are we thinking about the legacy of redlining, blockbusting, land theft, and settler colonialism that really shapes not how students just move to higher education, but through higher education? Who has unequal access to this, not just the same kind of AP exams and different things like that. I'm talking about those less talked about aspects of college, like who knows what office hours are, right? Who knows that system of unsaid rules and unwritten expectations that students are expected to not only know, but abide by from the moment they set foot on campus, but yet no one ever says anything.
I'm a first generation college graduate who has now been a professor for quite some time. And I remember the excitement of my family and my community when I was accepted into college. And then I remember stepping foot on the University of Virginia, and I had no idea what a bursar was or what that meant. I didn't know what the term registrar meant. And people were saying, these are the places you need to go to make sure you're financially cleared and you have your classes. And it was this uncertainty of everyone else seems to know this, but I don't. You are very candid in this book, right at the introduction, talking about your own experience and removing some of that stigma that people often contend with of saying, this is what it was for me. Share with our listeners a little bit about how your experience informs this book.
I am so glad that you mentioned bursar, because the first time I ever heard the term was when I was listening to Hamilton. Right. That was, and I had been through college at that point. I had not heard some of these terms myself. And again, the language in higher education is loaded and coded. right? Some of us, when we hear the word fellowship, we think about church on a Sunday morning. When other people hear about fellowship, they think about going to Oxford or Cambridge as a Rhodes Scholar, right? That is the difference in experiences. And so for me, I label myself a forever first generation college student because you never stop being that sojourner, that person who is experiencing everything new, right? That whether you are an undergrad, a graduate student, going in the professional world, right? Having to Google what's the difference between a Roth IRA and a 401k, all the new things that people get to hear at the dinner table. And so when I sit down with students, and in this book, I sat down with 125 students, Asian, Black, Latino, mixed, Native, and white from across the income spectrum. And so many of those conversations took me back to my own experiences as an undergraduate because they serve as foundation for my research and motivation for it. Because I remember how my college at the time thought that all students can leave for spring break, right? They thought the campus completely empty during spring break, but they forgot that they had let in their biggest class of lower income students. And so many of us, they opened the gates, but they forgot to keep the doors open. So they shut down the dining halls during spring break. And so for those of us who couldn't afford to leave, we had to figure out if we could afford to stay. Because food, when you have to pay for it every day, 3 meals a day, for a broke college student who's trying to support his family back home and support himself in school is expensive. And so when COVID closures came and that same kind of email saying we were leaving, we were closing, you have to go, I was transported to getting those messages back when I was a student, when they were just like, just leave in a quick sort of way. And so many of my students who I was interviewing spoke about it in the exact same way. They said it was like getting an eviction notice.
Let's talk about that time. I remember I was teaching a senior thesis seminar, sent the students home for spring break, and they never returned to campus.
Mhm.
And we would be on those Zooms, and I would notice it made a difference who had their cameras on. I never assumed that that meant their interest or their commitment. I knew that there were some students who were in a room with 4 other siblings. There were students who didn't want people to know the circumstances of their home life. There were students whose gender identity and expression when they were on campus was not safe for them to express at home. And so all those ways that colleges face these impossible choices of how do we keep people safe, while often assuming that home was a safe place, when for so many
Yes.
students it was not. What did you learn in writing about that period of time or in talking to those students that even with your tremendous experience made you take a step back and say, we've got to get this right?
What I want to talk about is the context and the conditions that students were learning under or not learning under. And now you're absolutely right. Sometimes the camera was off and sometimes the camera was on. And there were many stories that I document in the book of students renting out Italian castles, right? Italian villas. And getting, posting on Snapchat saying and TikTok saying this is your invitation to rent an Italian villa with 13-year-old friends and piling out of a Mercedes Benz and doing all kind of stuff, wearing propeller hats and different things like that. And there were other students who were sharing rooms because their families had to consolidate. They had to give up apartments. And so there were 3 families living in 2 bedroom apartments with 5 people in each room, then 5 people in the living room to make the money stretch as far as they possibly could. I wanted colleges to understand that. But the biggest thing that I wanted to do is I said, you know what? Let me leave the dining room and the bedrooms and the coffee tables. I wanted us to understand the communities that students were coming from because we so often ignore that larger context, right? Because there were 2 students who I interviewed, and both of them ran cross country and track in high school. When one person went home, they were able to go back to the beautiful Muir Woods and run in the beautiful the redwoods of San Francisco. And even when the U.S. government shut down the national park, she lived so close. She was like, "Well, I had unfettered access." She literally bragged about being able to walk into a closed national park, breaking in, and just having all the fresh air, all the space that she could possibly want. And yet another student who also ran cross country, She said, I'm too afraid to go more than a quarter mile from my house. Just 2 weeks before campus closed, there was a drive-by on the street across from her and a bullet hole lodged into her house. When we understand the context that our students come from, and more importantly, that their families still remain in, we understand why some students get a call at 2 o'clock in the morning and it's never anything good. Who's more likely to get that call? And so I interrogated that because our mental health services are not used to dealing with place-based problems like that. They're not used to dealing with opioid overdoses. They're not used to drive-by shootings. They're used to those standard things that 18 to 21-year-olds typically go through that don't encounter spaces like that. And so for me, understanding closures was my push to say COVID did not create the inequalities. It exacerbated the very ones that universities were ignoring. And what I try to do in Class Dismissed, especially when it turns to understanding where students come from and how it shapes their everyday reality on school, was to turn our attentions to those overlooked dynamics that make students work extra hours so their families can get money, that make them download apps like Citizen so they know just how close the dangers are to their house, right? Instead of looking at the water main break on 3rd Street, they're trying to figure out how close the gunshots were to their homes. They're not waiting for text messages or Facebook posts or Instagram messages anymore. They're tracking it in real life time, sitting in organic chemistry, being distracted.
That was Professor Anthony Abraham Jack, author of Class Dismissed: When Colleges Ignore Inequality and Students Pay the Price. Coming up, Professor Jack shares how his work has changed college policies and practices. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're discussing inequality in U.S. education. We're joined now by Dr. Anthony Abraham Jack, Associate Professor of Higher Education Leadership at the Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. His new book is Class Dismissed: When Colleges Ignore Inequality and Students Pay the Price. As I spoke with Professor Jack, I heard a willingness to extend grace to students amid the challenges they face. And unfortunately, it's something that not all of our colleagues in academia do. Ask Professor Jack how his research and his own experiences shape the ways that he approaches being a professor.
It shapes everything I do. It was one of the reasons why I took the position to be the faculty director of the Newberry Center, which specifically works with and supports first-gen undergraduate, graduate, and professional students. People forget the first time they dove into a pool or the first time they rode a bike and how hard it was to let go and the training wheels and all that kind of stuff, right? That I never want to forget that, because I want to remind us to think about where students come from, because how it shows up in our policies is equally problematic. In the book, I talk about why we need to revisit our academic leave policies, because I fundamentally believe and talk about extending grace, but this isn't some like moralistic extending grace. This is also like research-based. Students often struggle in school because they don't know how to deal with the old responsibilities of home and the new role of student, and how much that conflicts. They take an extra shift at a job when they know they have a 20-page paper due because the rent is due, and rent comes before papers, right? In their mind, that's in their calculation. And so they struggle with the 20-page paper, or they take shortcuts to finish it. I'm not trying to give them a pass. I'm just saying this is the reality that many of our more disadvantaged students experience. But what got me and what hurt me when writing a book is when I looked at the academic leave policies. They're more punitive at schools than some parole policies across the country, because they ask students to complete requirements that they literally can't do if you understand where they come from. Right? If you're from rural Appalachia or you're from a reservation and you go to a school that then requires you to work a full-time job to be able to return, many questions arise, right? Are there jobs available that, period? Are there jobs available when your family is only 50% employed because there's nothing there? The mine just closed, or there's a divide between the reservation in town and you can't find jobs. Are the jobs that you will find, do they count for your school? Because they're more likely to say yes to an internship style position, a white collar job. But if you're doing sanitation or working at Target or Walmart, they might not count that. If our requirements is to do this kind of work, but we're sending students back to places that where there are no jobs, and we've known that, are we actually sending them back to a place that forces them to either leave to comply or make their stop out from school a full on withdrawal? People who write those policies are often not from the perspective of being first gen. Because let's not forget, people who have PhDs are 12 to 25 times more likely to have a PhD parent than the average American. That class position leads to class bias and leads to punitive policies that disproportionately punish and hurt our most disadvantaged.
The thing, Professor, that keeps coming up to me as I'm listening to you are these new policy efforts where colleges are saying, in the wake of this affirmative action decision, we are going to do away with legacy admissions. That's the way we're going to promote equality. And I keep thinking, just as we started to get through the door in numbers, now we have nothing that we can pass on to our descendants, right? That idea of legacy status isn't just about some elite person with a lot of money and a name on a building. It is exacerbating inequality in different ways. What do you say to students and their families, their caregivers, who are thinking about where should I go? Where should I make the investment? Or what should I be considering? What should they know about the work that you do?
I spoke to many of my classmates about that because many of us are having kids who are about that age and about legacy admissions and what should be done. And my thing is, we must still realize that because of just generations of discrimination, Black wealth is not white wealth. If you look at what names are on buildings, it is still disproportionately white. It is increasingly Asian, increasingly Black, but it's still disproportionately white. So we have to be careful to make sure that, I think about that Chris Rock sketch from like 30 years ago when he moved into his New Jersey neighborhood and he had just sold out his world tour, and he was like making all this money, and he looked at his neighbors and all of them were dentists because that generational wealth. He had to be the most popular comedian in the world to be able to afford where they were living. And so it was like that interesting thing. But what I would tell families is this about my work. I'm not a poverty pimp. I'm not somebody who's just going to document terrible stories and then have these sob stories, make a few people cry, and then move on. Like, I want to change higher education for the better. My work fundamentally asks the questions, now that we know what we know, what are we going to do about it? Because in my work, I also offer actionable steps that universities and colleges can take to make a more equitable campus a reality for their students. Over 85 colleges have used my work to address food insecurity on their campus because now they open their dining halls during spring break. Because of my work, faculty members are now defining what office hours are to their students, right? Office hours are a time that faculty dedicate to their students to answer their questions about the course and other things about being a college student. Faculty are actually saying that last part now. They're not only saying when they are, but they're saying what they are. And in this book, I extend that faculty student engagement piece to also get faculty to make explicit how jobs working with them as research assistant, course assistant, and teaching assistants, how we get those positions and why we should go for them. Right. And so those are the kind of things that my work is doing because I don't want just students who have quote unquote like been here before because they went to they went to Hotchkiss or they went to Andover or they went to Horace Mann to be able to get those really amazing positions that faculty become advisors, advisors become mentors, and then lifelong friends through. I want everybody to have access to those positions and actually everybody to know that those positions are for them. So my work is about fundamentally disrupting that reproduction of inequality by not only providing evidence that it's there, but then also providing actionable steps to be taken to make sure that we're better prepared for it.
Let's just call a thing. Higher education was not made for people who look like us. And I just don't mean phenotypically, I mean our experiences and our backgrounds. And so when we show up in those spaces, it automatically rankles some people. And it sounds, Professor, that you have said, okay, but I'm here. And this is what I'm going to do with this opportunity and this platform that you have. As we come to the close of our conversation, you mentioned the impact you've had, 80 different schools who are embracing this work and thinking about the changes that they need to make. Is there one thing that you say, not that this will erase all the ills, but if schools can commit to this one thing, it will at least set them on the pathway to rethinking inequality and eventually making that change? What should they prioritize?
I always want to put people on a path to fundamentally understand what it means when I say that access ain't inclusion. I want someone who engaged my work to question what they take for granted about what students know and what students can afford. I'm talking about that interpersonal skills of knowing how to navigate, clubs, what clubs to be part of, the airport test that you have to pass to get a job, when you should go get an internship, and when knowing that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but it's a sign of strength, because now you know that you are approaching the barriers of your own understanding, and the next step is better travel with someone. I want us to question what we take for granted about what we know about those things. And so if I can get someone to understand that office hours are not something that everybody knows, that fellowship is not always about Oxford, that sometimes when you say shadowing somebody, you mean shadowing a doctor, not shadow puppets, right? I want us to question those things, because that hopefully can get us on the path of saying, wow, why did it take Tony Jack, who's a faculty member, who has a PhD, went to great schools, all the way to he listened to Hamilton the first time they hear the word bursar and understand quite what it meant. And when you start on that path, you begin to really see just how much you took for granted and how many people are outside of that cone of reference.
I appreciate all the ways that you are challenging us to recognize those things, but also to empowering us to make those kinds of changes, to really have an educational system that serves us collectively. Anthony Abraham Jack is Associate Professor of Higher Education Leadership at Boston University. His new book is Class Dismissed: When Colleges Ignore Inequality and Students Pay the Price. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon Aiken, Meg Fitzgerald, and Meg Dalton. Our intern is Frankie DeVivo. Disrupted has more than 200 episodes highlighting changes and change makers. And with all those disruptions, you may not know where to start. That's why we made a playlist to give new listeners a sense of what this show is all about. You can find that playlist on our website at ctpublic.org/disrupted. To listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. And you can listen for new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.